The night was cold, and the streets were empty, except for one shadow curled up under a tattered blanket. Her name was Emma, once a woman with dreams, hopes, and a family. Now, she was just another forgotten face on the sidewalks of the city. She shivered, hunger gnawing at her, as footsteps echoed on the pavement. A man in a tailored suit stopped before her. His shoes were polished, his aura commanding. He looked down, his face expressionless, eyes cold as ice. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "But I have a way out for you." Emma's eyes widened, suspicion and hope fighting within her. A way out? She had stopped believing in miracles long ago. The man continued, his words measured and deliberate. "I need an heir. Someone to carry my bloodline. But emotions complicate things, relationships, love, attachment. I don't have time for that." Emma's heart raced. What was he talking about? The man leaned closer, his presence overwhelming. "You will carry my child. And once the baby is born, you'll disappear. No questions. No attachments. In return, I'll give you enough money to leave this life behind, forever." She felt the world spin around her. A child? His child? He spoke again, his tone colder than before. "If you refuse, you stay here, forgotten, starving, dying. But if you accept, you get a second chance. A chance to start over." Her heart ached, memories of the life she lost flooding back. The laughter of a child she once held, the warmth of a home she once knew. She looked at him, trying to read his intentions, but his face was a mask, devoid of any humanity. Why her? Why would a man like him choose someone like her? His eyes flickered, just for a moment, revealing a shadow of something. Pain? Regret? But then it vanished. He extended his hand, his voice firm. "Decide now. You have nothing to lose, and everything to gain." Emma's hands trembled as she looked at his outstretched hand. This was her ticket out of hell, but at what cost? To carry a child, feel it grow inside her, and then walk away as if it meant nothing? She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Could she really do this? Could she carry a child only to abandon it? But then she remembered the hunger, the cold, the hopelessness. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with desperation. "I'll do it." Her voice broke, barely a whisper. The man's lips curled into a cold, satisfied smile. "Good. But remember, once the child is born, you will be nothing more than a memory. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, her heart shattering. She had made her choice. But little did she know, this was only the beginning. The beginning of a journey that would change everything, for both of them. What could possibly make a man with everything want a child from someone who had nothing? And why did he insist she disappear without a trace? The answer would leave her shattered, and him forever changed. The contract was cold, precise, and devoid of any emotion, just like the man who had written it. Leonard Blackwood was a man who controlled everything in his life, his business empire, his public image, his wealth. Everything, except his own bloodline. The heir he desperately needed would ensure his legacy, his name, and his empire's continuity. But Leonard had no interest in marriage, love, or even a relationship. In his world, emotions were a weakness, attachments were liabilities. He needed an heir, not a family. That's why he chose her. Emma. Homeless. Desperate. Forgotten by society. She had nothing, and that made her perfect. She would have no leverage, no power to fight back, no one to care if she disappeared. Leonard watched her from his office window, his eyes cold and calculating. She was huddled under the awning of an abandoned shop, clutching her worn-out coat against the biting wind. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but there was a flicker of life in them. A stubbornness. Good. He needed someone who could carry his child to term without breaking. His lawyer entered the room, laying the contract on his desk. All the terms you requested, sir. No emotional attachment, no rights to the child, and a mandatory departure after birth. She can't come back. Ever. Leonard's lips curled into a cold smile. Perfect. He walked out, his expensive shoes echoing on the marble floor, and stepped into his car. The driver pulled up to where Emma sat, shivering, her eyes fixed on the ground. She didn't look up until the car door opened, and he stood before her, tall, imposing, impeccably dressed. Her eyes widened, fear flickering across her face. I don't have anything, sir. Please. I won't bother anyone. Her voice was fragile, a whisper. Leonard's gaze was unyielding. I'm not here to remove you. I'm here to offer you a way out. Confusion replaced fear. Her brow furrowed, her chapped lips parting. A way out? He nodded, his expression devoid of sympathy. I need an heir. A child to carry on my legacy. But I don't have time for complications, love, attachment, emotional nonsense. Emma's heart raced. What was this man talking about? He continued, his words sharp and deliberate. You will carry my child. Once the baby is born, you will disappear. No questions. No attachments. In return, I will give you enough money to leave this life behind, forever. Her mind spun. It sounded surreal, almost like a cruel joke. But his face was serious, his eyes cold and piercing. She tried to stand but stumbled, her legs weak from hunger. He caught her arm, his grip firm, and helped her steady herself. For a moment, she saw something in his eyes, pity, humanity. But it vanished as quickly as it came. She pulled away, her body trembling. I don't understand. Why me? He looked at her, his expression indifferent. Because you have nothing to lose. No one will come looking for you. No one will care. His words cut deep, the truth searing through her like a blade. She lowered her head, shame washing over her. He was right. She had nothing. No family, no friends, no future. But a child? Could she really carry a child, bring a life into this world, and then walk away? Leonard's voice was cold, pressing. You'll have more money than you can imagine. Enough to start over anywhere you want. But the child will be mine. Entirely. You will never see it again. Her heart ached, the thought of abandoning her own flesh and blood tearing at her. But she remembered the cold nights, the hunger, the hopelessness. This was her only chance at survival. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with desperation. What? What if I say no? His gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. Then you stay here. Alone. Hungry. Forgotten. You continue to rot on these streets until death finally comes for you. His words were merciless, but they were true. She was dying out here, slowly and painfully. She felt tears burn her eyes, shame and fear mixing with a faint glimmer of hope. A chance. A way out. But at what cost? Leonard pulled a pen from his coat pocket, holding it out to her. Sign the contract. Agree to my terms. And I promise, you'll never have to live like this again. Her hands trembled as she took the pen, her vision blurred by tears. The contract was thick, filled with legal jargon she couldn't understand. But she saw the numbers, the promise of wealth she had never dreamed of. The cost was her soul. Her heart. The child she hadn't even conceived yet. But the cold wind reminded her of the cruel reality she was trapped in. She looked at him, his face cold and unfeeling, a stranger who held her future in his hands. She took a deep breath, her heart shattering, and signed her name. Leonard's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Good. You made the right choice." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, the weight of her decision crushing her. Emma looked down at the paper, her name scrawled in ink, sealing her fate. She had sold her body, her soul, and her child's future, all to escape a life of nothingness. But little did she know, this was only the beginning. The beginning of a journey that would shatter everything she believed, and change him forever. The first flutter was faint, almost imperceptible, like a whisper beneath her skin. Emma froze, her hand instinctively moving to her belly, eyes wide with wonder. It happened again, a tiny movement, gentle and fragile. A life growing inside her. A heartbeat intertwined with hers. She had known about the pregnancy for weeks now. The doctors arranged by Leonard had confirmed it with cold efficiency. To them, it was just another transaction. But to Emma, it was a miracle. She had thought she could do it. Carry the child, fulfill her end of the contract, and then walk away. No attachments. No emotions. Just money in exchange for life. But she hadn't expected this. Every day, she felt the child growing stronger. Tiny kicks, gentle flutters, each movement a reminder that she was not alone. She would talk to the baby, whispering secrets, dreams, and hopes she knew could never come true. She sang lullabies she remembered from her childhood, songs her mother used to sing to her. The bond was forming, unbreakable and pure. A love so powerful it terrified her. She tried to ignore it, tried to distance herself. But with each passing day, the baby became more real, more hers. Leonard visited occasionally, his demeanor cold and businesslike. He never asked how she felt, never inquired about her emotions. To him, she was just a vessel, a means to an end. But even he couldn't ignore the changes. Her eyes sparkled when she spoke of the baby's movements. She would unconsciously cradle her belly, her touch gentle and protective. It made him uneasy. One evening, he found her in the garden, humming softly to herself, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She was smiling, her face radiant with maternal love. He felt a strange pang in his chest, a sensation he hadn't known in years. He cleared his throat, and her head snapped up, the smile vanishing instantly. Her eyes widened with fear, as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. He didn't like the look in her eyes. It made him feel guilty. "Everything is going as planned?" His voice was cold, detached. She nodded quickly, her hands dropping to her sides. "Yes, the baby is healthy. The doctors say everything is progressing perfectly." His gaze lingered on her belly, watching as it shifted slightly, a tiny kick. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Good. Keep it that way." He turned to leave but hesitated. For a brief moment, he wanted to ask her, to ask about the baby. Was it a boy or a girl? Did it respond to her voice? Did it recognize his blood in its veins? But he said nothing, his heart hardening once more. Emotions were a weakness. Attachments were liabilities. He had no time for either. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Emma and the child grew stronger. She started talking to the baby more, sharing stories of her past, her dreams, her fears. She knew it was dangerous. She knew she was breaking the rules. But how could she ignore the life growing inside her? She tried to picture the child's face, wondered if it would have her eyes or his cold, piercing stare. She dreamed of holding the baby, rocking it to sleep, singing lullabies she had once loved. She imagined the warmth of tiny fingers curling around hers, the softness of a newborn's breath. And each time, her heart broke a little more. She knew the contract by heart. Once the child was born, she would disappear. No visits, no letters, no place in the child's life. To the baby, she would be nothing more than a ghost. But how could she walk away now? How could she leave behind the life she had grown to love? She cried herself to sleep most nights, her tears soaking the pillow. She would cradle her belly, whispering apologies to the child she could never keep. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you, but I can't stay." One evening, she felt a powerful kick, stronger than any before. She gasped, her hands pressing against her belly as the baby moved again, a forceful nudge that left her breathless. A laugh escaped her lips, followed by tears. The baby was strong, determined, full of life. She felt pride, overwhelming and fierce. This was her child, her blood, her heart. How could she possibly give it away? But then the door opened, and Leonard walked in, his presence chilling the air. He watched her, his gaze sharp, noticing the tear tracks on her cheeks, the protective way she held her belly. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. "You're getting too attached," he said, his voice cold and accusatory. She flinched, guilt washing over her. I'm not. It moved." The baby kicked. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. A long silence stretched between them before he spoke, his tone icy. "Remember the contract. The child is mine. You will leave once it's born. No questions. No attachments." His words were sharp, cutting through her heart like a blade. She lowered her head, her voice trembling. "I understand." He turned to leave, his shoulders tense. But before he could walk away, she called out, her voice breaking. Do you feel anything? Knowing your child is growing inside me, does it mean anything to you?" He froze, his back rigid, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, she thought she saw his shoulders shake, a crack in his cold armor. But then he straightened, his voice colder than ever. "No. It means nothing." He walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Emma sank to the floor, her heart shattered. She held her belly, feeling the baby move inside her, a cruel reminder of the love she could never keep. She was alone. And soon, her child would be, too. But she couldn't stop loving it. No matter how hard she tried. The bond was already there, unbreakable. And she knew, no matter what happened, she would never forget the life she carried. The life she had already lost. The pain was unbearable, ripping through her like fire. Emma gripped the hospital bed, her knuckles white, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face. She had never felt pain like this before. But through the agony, there was hope, a new life fighting its way into the world. Her child. A scream tore from her throat as another wave of pain hit, her body arching off the bed. The doctors surrounded her, their faces calm, voices cold and clinical. To them, she was just another patient, another body to bring life into the world. No one saw her tears. No one heard her whispers of love. "Push," the doctor commanded, his voice sharp and emotionless. She obeyed, her body racked with pain, her heart torn between hope and despair. With one final, agonizing push, the world fell silent. And then, the first cry. A tiny, fragile voice, wailing with the strength of life itself. Her heart shattered and healed in the same moment, her soul reaching out to the child she couldn't hold. The nurse held the baby up, its tiny limbs flailing, its voice echoing through the room. A boy. Her son. Emma's arms lifted instinctively, her heart yearning, her body aching to hold him just once. But the nurse didn't look at her. She walked past Emma and placed the child in the arms of the man standing at the door. Leonard. He stood there, tall and cold, his face emotionless as he looked down at the newborn. His son. His heir. His legacy. Emma watched, her vision blurred by tears, her arms falling limply to her sides. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her pain or her love. To him, she was nothing. Just a vessel. Just a means to an end. Her heart screamed, her soul shattering as she watched him hold her child. Their child. She wanted to scream, to fight, to rip the baby from his arms and run. But she was too weak, too broken, too lost. Leonard turned and walked away, the child cradled in his arms, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The door closed behind him, sealing her fate. She would never see her son again. Her chest heaved, silent sobs shaking her body as the cold reality settled in. She had given him everything, and he had taken it all. The nurse helped her sit up, her face devoid of sympathy. "You need to rest," she said, her voice hollow. But Emma felt nothing. She was empty, hollowed out, left with nothing but pain. The room grew colder, the silence suffocating. She closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear, wishing she could die. But the pain wouldn't end. Not yet. A whisper reached her ears, two voices just outside the door. She strained to hear, her heart beating weakly, her mind barely processing the words. "It's all taken care of. The child will be named as his heir. No one will challenge it now. That woman, she's out of the picture?" "Yes. She signed the contract. She has no rights. No one will ever know she was the mother." Emma's eyes flew open, horror flooding her senses. What were they saying? No rights? No one would know? She struggled to sit up, her body weak, her heart racing. She moved towards the door, her legs shaking, her head spinning. She pressed her ear against the cold wood, desperate to hear more. Leonard's voice was calm, calculated. She was perfect. No connections, no family. No one will ever look for her. The child is mine. My heir. My blood. She was just a vessel. Nothing more. Emma's knees buckled, and she collapsed against the door, her hands shaking, her heart breaking. Just a vessel. Nothing more. She was nothing to him. Nothing. A memory flashed through her mind, the day she signed the contract, his cold eyes watching her, his lips curling into a smile. She had trusted him, believed his promises of a better life, of hope. But it was all a lie. A cruel, calculated lie. She was nothing but a pawn in his game. A pawn to secure his wealth, his power, his empire. And her child, her baby, was just a tool. Her fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms. He had stolen everything from her. Her body, her soul, her child. She wanted to scream, to break down the door, to tear him apart. But she was weak, powerless, and alone. Tears streamed down her face, her heart shattered beyond repair. She was nothing. A ghost. A shadow. A memory that would fade with time. She had loved that child. Loved him more than life itself. And Leonard had taken him away, erased her from his life, from his future. She was a mother without a child. A woman without a purpose. A soul without hope. The door opened, and the nurse entered, her eyes cold and indifferent. "It's time for you to leave," she said, her voice void of compassion. Emma looked up, her face pale, her body trembling. She wanted to scream, to fight, to refuse. But her body was weak, her soul broken. She had no fight left. She stood, her legs shaking, her vision blurred by tears. She took one last look at the empty room, the bed where she had given birth, where her heart had shattered. Then she walked away, her steps heavy, her spirit crushed. She walked down the hallway, her head bowed, her hands trembling. She passed the nursery, her heart breaking as she heard the tiny cries of her son. Her child, her baby, her love. But she kept walking, her soul screaming, her heart bleeding. Because she was nothing. Just a vessel. Just a memory. And as she stepped out into the cold, dark night, the last piece of her heart shattered. She had lost everything. Her child, her love, her life. All taken by the man she had trusted. Leonard Blackwood. The father of her child, and the man who destroyed her soul. She disappeared into the darkness, a shadow among shadows. Forgotten. Erased. Just as he had planned. And Leonard walked away, his heir in his arms, his legacy secured. His heart as cold as ever. But he would soon learn. You can't erase love. No matter how hard you try. The mansion was silent, cold, and grand, just as Leonard had always preferred it. He stood by the window, cradling his newborn son in his arms, staring out at the sprawling estate below. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, would now belong to this child. His heir. His bloodline. His legacy. The baby squirmed, a soft whimper escaping his tiny lips. Leonard looked down, his expression impassive. The child's eyes were closed, his fists curled up, his face peaceful and innocent. Innocent. A strange feeling twisted in Leonard's chest, unfamiliar and unsettling. He tried to shake it off, reminding himself of the plan, the purpose, the necessity. This child was the key to everything. A pawn he had carefully calculated, a piece of the puzzle that secured his empire. But then the baby's eyes fluttered open, dark and wide, gazing up at him. Leonard's breath caught in his throat. Those eyes, they weren't his. They were hers. For the first time, he saw her face, Emma's face, in the child he held. The same dark eyes, filled with innocence and hope, the same softness, the same warmth. His chest tightened, his grip faltering. She had looked at him that way once, with hope, with trust, before he shattered her. He turned away, his heart pounding, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. Why did he feel like this? Why did her face haunt him now? She was gone, erased, forgotten. Just as he had planned. But her eyes stared back at him, her voice echoing in his mind. Does it mean anything to you? Knowing your child is growing inside me, does it mean anything at all? He clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the soft fabric of the baby's blanket. No. It meant nothing. He wouldn't let it. But his heart didn't listen. It remembered the way she looked at him, the way she had cradled her belly, the way she had loved the child he now held. A sharp pain shot through his chest, raw and cruel. He looked down at the baby, his heart racing, his vision blurring. He had taken everything from her. Her body, her soul, her child. And he had felt nothing. Until now. The baby whimpered again, his tiny hand reaching up, his fingers brushing against Leonard's cheek. A tear slipped free, unbidden, unwelcome. He tried to brush it away, but it wouldn't stop. His heart broke, shattered by the innocence of the life he held. A life he had created and stolen. The child was hers, and his. Their child. Their love. Their sacrifice. He sank to his knees, his arms wrapping around the tiny, fragile body. He felt the weight of his choices, the cruelty of his actions, the coldness of his heart. And he realized he was no better than the father who had abandoned him. He was repeating the cycle, inflicting the same pain he had spent his life escaping. A sob tore from his throat, raw and broken. He held the baby tighter, his tears falling freely now, his heart aching with a love he had denied. He had tried to erase her. But she was still here, in his arms, in his heart, in the eyes of the child he loved. The child he couldn't give up. The child he couldn't raise alone. He needed her. And she needed him. He stood, his resolve breaking, his heart opening. He would find her. He would bring her back. He would heal the wounds he had caused. He would fix what he had broken. No matter the cost. Because for the first time in his life, Leonard Blackwood finally understood what it meant to love. Leonard's car sped down the rain-slicked streets, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He had to find her. He had to bring her back. He had tried to erase her, but she was still there, haunting him in every breath, every heartbeat, every look from his son's eyes. She was a part of him now, and he couldn't live without her. The rain poured harder, the sky dark and heavy, matching the turmoil in his heart. He gripped the steering wheel, his fingers trembling. He had to make things right, if it wasn't too late. The alley was dark, shadows curling around broken bricks and forgotten dreams. He saw her, huddled beneath a worn-out blanket, her face pale, her body trembling. His heart shattered at the sight. Emma. The woman he had broken. The mother of his child. He stepped out of the car, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud, his coat soaking through. He didn't care. Nothing mattered except her. She looked up, her eyes wide, her face streaked with tears. Her hands instinctively cradled her stomach, a gesture she didn't even realize she was doing anymore. But the child was gone. Taken from her. Leonard's throat tightened, guilt crashing down on him. She looked so small, so broken, so lost. He had done this to her. He had destroyed her. Her lips parted, a whisper escaping, raw and broken. Why? Why are you here? His chest ached, his heart racing. He took a step closer, his hands shaking. I made a mistake. I was wrong. I thought I could take him and feel nothing. But I was wrong. Her eyes widened, her body curling tighter, as if trying to protect herself from more pain. You took everything from me. My child. My heart. Her voice cracked, a sob breaking through, her shoulders shaking. How could you be so cruel? Leonard fell to his knees, his head bowed, his hands clutching the cold, wet earth. I don't have an excuse. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you. He needs you. Her body went rigid, her eyes narrowing. What are you saying? He looked up, his face pale, his eyes raw with pain and regret. I can't do this without you. I can't raise him alone. I can't love him the way you can. I thought I could, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. Her breath hitched, her hands trembling. He took another step, his voice breaking. He looks at me, and I see you. I see the love you have for him, the love I tried to erase. But it's still there, in him, in you, in me. I need you, Emma. He needs his mother. Her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. You really mean that? He nodded, his heart breaking. Yes. I need you. I need you to save me, to save him, to save us. Her sobs grew louder, her body shaking. She wanted to hate him, to scream, to run. But she looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw the truth. He was broken, just like her. Slowly, painfully, she stood, her legs trembling, her heart aching. She took a step towards him, her hand reaching out, her fingers brushing his. His eyes widened, his body shuddering at her touch. I don't know if I can forgive you, her voice was weak, fragile. But I can't walk away. Not from him. Not from you. Hope flickered in his eyes, his body shaking with relief. Thank you. Thank you. He reached for her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her close. She trembled in his embrace, her tears soaking his coat. But she didn't push him away. For the first time, they held each other, truly held each other, their hearts breaking and healing together. They were two broken souls, shattered by pain, but bound by love. He pulled back, his hands cradling her face, his eyes soft, vulnerable. I promise. I'll never hurt you again. I'll never let you go. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and raw. I'll stay, for him. For our son. But you'll have to earn my forgiveness. He nodded, his face filled with determination. I will. Every day. I promise. She leaned into him, her body tired, her heart weary. But there was hope, fragile and beautiful, blooming between them. They stood together, the rain pouring around them, washing away the past, cleansing the pain. Together, they would start anew. Together, they would heal.